Good morning. Welcome to Hamilton Woodtype and Printing Museum. My name is Jim Moran, and I am the collections officer and the master printer here at the museum. I'll be joined on the tour this morning by my brother Bill, who is the museum's artistic director. And we're going to take you through history, and therefore there's probably 2 or 3 that we need to make you aware of. The first one will be Hamilton, because that's the most important one. And so as we move along, what I'll be talking about is Hamilton's beginnings, but you also have the museum's beginnings and how that came about. For those of you who have never been here, Two Rivers, Wisconsin is about a 3-hour ride north of Chicago, straight up Lake Michigan. So if you are thinking about Wisconsin, we're right about there. Anyway, the point is that this is the place where Hamilton began his business back in 1880. So I'm going to begin walking along, and I'll show you those first efforts and give you an idea how we got started. So to begin with, it was not planned. I guess that is one way of looking at it. Hamilton really was only doing a favor for a friend who said, hey, you're good with wood, why don't you make something for me so I can get this poster done in time? The reason that the guy couldn't get type from somewhere else is because all of the US type makers in 1879 were on the East Coast. That actually became a huge advantage to Hamilton, because once he cuts the type and the guy likes it and asks him to do it again and again and again, when Hamilton begins thinking about starting this business, his huge advantage is that he is the only person in the middle of the country, and certainly there's nobody west of him. So when you think of the explosion of the population in 1880, you have Milwaukee and Madison and Detroit and Chicago and St. Paul all becoming really huge, all needing type for various needs. And so one of the primary needs for wood type is newspaper headlines. And if you consider the volume of newspapers just between here and Milwaukee, that's a lot of type. Now, a newspaper typically has 2 kinds of type. Metal is the small text-based type, and the big stuff has to be wood. It's a weight issue, it's a property of lead issue. You cannot cut 6 or 8 point wood type. You cannot cast 36 line wood or metal type. So anyway, Hamilton sticks with the thing he's good at, which is wood, and he creates a style of type that we refer to as veneer. Based on the fact that Hamilton was used to working with veneer, specifically from the holly tree, and that is what he used to cut out his characters on a scroll saw, mount them onto a block, and there is your holly wood type. So if you read it wrong and it's Hollywood type, get that out of your head. This has nothing to do with California, but it does have to do with the fact that Hamilton grew dramatically in those first 15 years. He grows at such a rate that he begins putting so much pressure on his competitors that he is now buying them out and becoming bigger and adding more and more type to his collection. But one of the things that he's particularly adept at is taking the advice of those individuals that he bought out, and when he absorbs some of the major type makers, I guess you could say Heber Wells, Morgan Wilcox, Tubbs, and eventually William Page, his big thing is that they're telling him, get rid of the holly, get rid of the veneer. What you want to do is use a solid piece of maple and route it out. So by about 1893, Hamilton's got his last competitor on a major scale purchased. He now has a monopoly on the country, and he's free to switch to this method of making type, as well as charging whatever he wants. So we'll take a walk down this aisle and begin to give you an idea of that method of preparing wood for cutting type.
One of the other advantages that Hamilton has is geography. They're close to the forests of Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and so as the name of the city implies, with two rivers to float lumber downstream into the town, there is not only wood coming to you, the natural material coming to you from the Neshota and the Mishicot River, but also Lake Michigan. And so one of the huge advantages is you can ship a lot of material by boat. And the two rivers becomes a competitive advantage for them in terms of access to resources.
Well, and we're standing in front of what Hamilton eventually turned into, because you've got this business that begins by doing nothing more than cutting type, but just through natural logic, he goes from type to type cabinets to composing tables to all kinds of wooden printers furniture, and he branches out further and further, and so you eventually see this massive factory on the confluence of the East and the West Twin Rivers, or as Bill put it, the Neshota and the Mishicot, but they flow out into Lake Michigan. This is 1.2 million square feet of industry that it turned into. But back to type. What we're going to look at now is really that equipment that in essence takes the trunk of the tree and turns it into something that can be cut more readily into type. So you've got what is referred to as the carriage saw, that is more of a handmade piece for cutting trunks into usable pieces. You can't dry a log evenly if you try to do it in a chunk that big or this big. In fact, what you have to do is cut it down to a relatively small piece that they refer to as a half round, or in some cases a half pie. But anyway, the point is what you've got is something about 1.25 inches thick that's going to be kiln dried for upwards of almost an entire year before it has a moisture content that's considered acceptable. That way this is not going to warp or crack as it goes through its life. So once this is ready, it's run through two basic machines that are off to my left here, and the first one is a sander, and that will use a 4-drum system to begin milling that down to the specific height that all type needs to be. For those who are printers, 918 is a common number, but for those who aren't, that is the height of type. And so this machine is particularly precise for doing that, and it was designed specifically for this process. So this is the original sander that they had. Next to it is a planer, because essentially the half rounds come off of this machine. They are flipped over and moved on to the next one for bringing down to that specific surface size. So each piece then will have to be checked. It has to be something so tight in size that anything that goes more than 3/1000ths of an inch over is considered rejected. After that, the wood is shellacked to give it a nice hard surface, because in the end, the smoother the wood, the smoother the type, the better the print. So you have them preparing that wood, and from this standpoint, once you've got the shellac on it, you're ready to go. And so that begins the next portion of it, which would be the making of patterns, because as Hamilton grows, he's accumulating styles of type, and that means more and more different styles to satisfy a market that wants things that are elegant and plain and big and small. And so you have to remember that Hamilton is working even from the beginning days from 36 points, about 3/8 of an inch, all the way up to 3 feet on a regular basis. So I'm going to let Bill do a little explaining here about the patterns and how that process is done.
So as Jim said, pattern making was a really important part of the process of cutting wood type. And the way you can tell that this is not actually a piece of wood type is because it's fairly thin. there also happens to be an X on the other side. And so the early wood type cutters were nothing if not economical in terms of use of materials. So a large pattern would be cut with a pantograph, sometimes by hand, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And this was the source material from which the wood type was cut. And when we demonstrate the pantograph, you'll understand that a little better. So a big letter R, as beautiful as it is a really thoughtful, hand-drawn concave Tuscan, if I'm not mistaken. But in addition to that, I also want to talk about the patterns that you see right here. When Hamilton acquires his competition, Darius Wells, Heber Wells, and others, he also acquired a lot of patterns from them. And so one of the things that you start to see here is an increased complexity of design. When we look at these details on this bifurcated Tuscan, we start to see these gorgeous elements that they're starting to add into type design. We've got this nice drop shadow letter Y with some ornamentation on the inside, this beautiful E and this 4, and these are two that I really want to call your attention to because they were donated to the museum in the early 2000s. Somebody had them, I believe, in a garage here in Two Rivers. And at some point, Hamilton Manufacturing decided they didn't need them or want them anymore. Someone collects them and keeps them, and they brought them into the museum. Well, at first glance, these look like really complex number 4 and a letter E. But on closer inspection, one of the things that you notice is certain parts of the E and certain parts of the 4 are cut at a lower contour. And so we found this really interesting and then discovered in looking at Hamilton's specimen sheets and Hamilton's predecessor's specimen sheets that these are actually type patterns for chromatic type. So your first cutting of type is cut with this number 4. And you'd cut a piece of type for that. And then the chromatic piece of type, which is the sibling that goes with this 4, is then cut with these lower portions. And so this is really an ingenious way of embedding two patterns of type into a single piece of wood. And so we not only admire the complexity and the detail of what goes into these designs, but we also appreciate the ingenuity in terms of capturing design details and then using a single piece of wood for a pattern that's going to give you perfect registration when you're cutting that second piece of type. So we step back from this a little bit and we kind of look at the simplicity of these sans serif letter forms, and the fact that we've got a streamer typeface, which is a solid cut piece of type with a letter reversed out of it. And the design is really what we come to appreciate in terms of craftsmanship that these type cutters had as a skill that we are only really beginning to understand what they really achieved. One of the typical ways that Hamilton made patterns is they would take a piece of veneer wood, thin veneer wood, and they would mount that piece of wood onto a larger block of wood. And a piece of wood this size you can cut out with a scroll saw. And it allows you to get a tremendous amount of detail. And then it gets mounted in the way that you see it here. This is Nick Sherman's beautiful Brilski typeface. And here we have the pattern that was used to cut that, and we followed their lead by putting different letters on both sides of this. And here we see the finished letter H that was cut from that. And so you're asking yourself the question right now, how do you cut type? We're going to turn this portion of the program back over to Jim. And he's right over here in the pantograph area. I'm going to carry these things over here with me, and we'll talk a little bit about how the pantograph works. I see that you've already got a pattern and some wood locked up in the pantograph. Jim, do you want to say anything more about these two samples or jump into
I won't say anything about those. Since I've got something on there, I'll take a walk over here and give you a rough idea on how the pantograph works. Now, the important thing, though, is to know that there is a specific demonstration by George Brilski, who is our type cutter, later in the program, so that will be a better time if you really want to learn the nuts and bolts of the pantograph. But one of the things that I think is interesting is that these machines most likely came from the type cutter designer William Page, who Hamilton bought out. And so I don't know if you can see the photograph that we've got, but Hamilton is standing over near the pantographs that's still in operation. So we are cutting type, but what you are really looking at here is a tracer and a router. Pattern is in this place, and you'll note that it's about 4 inches, and the block of wood is about 2 inches. But anyway, this is a scalable machine down to 1/3 of the original pattern size. So the process involves an individual choosing the pattern from a Hamilton specimen book, placing an order for both the size of the type as well as the style, and then it is cut here, based on the quantity that they want. Like I said, more about that to come later, but it is interesting to note that wood type is what we refer to as display type. And what that means is that this is usually used for shorter phrases as opposed to text type, which would be more for a book, or lengthier sentences. So from here, we're going to move on to the trimming table, because there's an aspect of cutting type which has to be done manually, and we'll bring you over to that area right now.
While we're heading over there, I think it's also worth pointing out that Hamilton made patterns for a variety of applications. We've got this beautiful baseball player here that you could also cut in the same style as wood type. And so it wasn't just type that they were cutting, it was also clip art, the clip art of its time.
Right, right. And so one of the aspects of a pantograph is that its tracer is round for the smoothness of moving around the individual shape. But that roundness also leaves round edges, if you will. And when you consider that certain characters actually have points in them, well, then you would really prefer that those be cut out to make a perfect cut, a perfect edge. So the trimmer's job would be to take that set of type, and they've got their own tools that they would often make, but then they would sit at tables like this and put that character into place so that they could literally carve out those areas. So in essence, they are a bit like engravers in that they're incredibly adept cutting very fine lines. No patterns to follow here, no templates other than the knowledge of how it should look. So the trimmer's job was extremely important, and you had to be extremely precise. Otherwise, the printers are going to let you know, right? We assume that one 8 is going to look like the next 8, and if it doesn't, well, it comes back, I suppose. So anyway, that is basically the end of the trimming portion of it. What we're going to do is move on quickly to another thing that Hamilton did quite a bit of, which was making borders. The machine over here is referred to as a die stamper, and in essence we are mashing hard rock maple into narrow blocks of wood to create patterns that can be used for borders. So this machine is basically applying pressure, and the operator is moving it in timing with the plunger that has the die in it, and so it stamps and stamps and stamps, and then creates a specific image based on the design that's needed. So you may need several dies in order to make a specific border, but it was a big deal in the day. But like so many of the methods of type in itself, as you know, we evolve the kinds of type that we want, and we go for the more modern look, which is often the plainer look. And borders, in essence, went by the wayside as well, but there were also other methods that meant that this became obsolete. So certainly offset printing and lithography would have rendered this machine less than useful. From here, we're going to move on to what Hamilton is doing in type today, if you will. And so I'll let Bill guide you through the legacy type area.
One of the things that we strive to do as a working museum is to fulfill a mission of continuing to use the technology, the presses, and the wisdom of the people who taught us this craft over multiple generations. How do we employ that in the 21st century? So in 2005, Matthew Carter agreed to cut a typeface for Hamilton, and the first new face that the museum did was this typeface called Van Lanen. And Van Lanen is, as you can see, a chromatic typeface. So you've got an exterior and an interior of this letter form. We can see the positive and the negatives of these letter forms. And one of the things that comes with a chromatic typeface is that you have to be a really good printer in order to make those things register. The printer's job is made easier by the type cutters such that you have to place the C on the wood block in the exact same place as the negative portion is on the wood block. So when you put those letters on the press bed, when you put the negative spaces, the negative letters down, and you print with it, when you come back and print the interior letters, they have to register perfectly. That skill set of cutting blocks is something that we weren't fully aware of as a museum until you try to do it. Some of the other typefaces that we have done as part of our wood type legacy project is Arts, designed by Eric Spiekerman. And we've got Lustig Elements here, which is designed by Craig Welsh and Elaine Lustig-Cohen. And these are all examples, as I said, of the wood type legacy project. And that is to name contemporary typeface design done by modern masters after the people who worked at Hamilton, who volunteered at the museum and helped get the museum started. Louise Feely, graphic designer and type designer out of New York, designed this beautiful futurist font named for Mardell Dubeck. And we've got a gorgeous border design created by Marion Banchis named Bernice. And what you see here is the border material that makes up these patterns. And so we see a letterpress printed example of it and some digital examples of how that typeface can be used. Speaking of digital, all of the typefaces that are part of the Wood Type Legacy Project are available as digital fonts as well. One of the things that we try to do as a working museum is not just focus on serving the letterpress printers of the world, but also the type nerds out there who want to bring these gorgeous typefaces to your computer desktop. So these are all available in digital format. Our friends at P22 Type Foundry out in Buffalo, New York, help us bring the digital fonts to life while we are creating the wood type here in Two Rivers. The last font I'll show you is this gorgeous face named Konop by type designer Mark Simonson. And we've got more wonderful digital typefaces in the works, which you will be hearing about throughout the weekend.
So the collection at the museum involves so many different things, and of course it is type, but it's also the machines. And so the presses that we have and have more recently acquired become a big part of it. And because of the large blocks in the collection, we needed a really large press in order to do it. So this Campbell press is from about 1895. We picked it up almost a year ago, and it's wonderful because its format is, I believe, 33 by 44, and so it allows us to print some of the largest things we've got. But in addition to big presses, we've got a variety of machinery that takes you from typecasting to printing to bindery, etc. So what we're going to do at this point is leave the main room and move into the central room and begin talking about some of the other parts of the collection that were used also in conjunction with the making of type. So when we were talking about newspapers earlier on, I was mentioning the fact that wood type is primarily used for headlines of the newspaper. However, you did need machinery to set the text, and as some of you may know, the primary machine there was the linotype, invented in 1884 and used for composing massive amounts of type. So in this room, we've got a variety of different things that both speak to the composition of type. So we're going from the linotype to a large newspaper-based linotype, a monotype typecaster, or I should say typesetter, Ludlows. In other words, there's a lot of different pieces within this room that eventually work their way into the bindery aspect of printing. So a little bit of a mashup of various things to give people a sense of the tools that were used and the machines that did everything from putting lines on paper to printing lithography stones. But we are going to make a little bit of a diversion in this room and take you into the back, a little bit of a sneak peek of the organized mess that we've got here. So we're going to go through the wall and into the back storage to give people a sense of what we call the Inquirer collection.
So what you're looking at here is museum storage, kind of a Raiders of the Lost Ark room, if you will, but unlike the Raiders of the Lost Ark, we know where everything is, and we have cataloged a lot of it. Jim's holding a really beautiful block of a person who's diving into a pool of fire, and the headline reads, "On Fire, Into Fire," so it gives you an example of a really smart hand-carved block. And we've got something that's about 14 inches tall, and the other end of the spectrum is this little aisle that you're looking at here. And so what you're looking at along these blocks are what we call two-sheet blocks. These are 40 inches by 52 inches. And what the chalk writing that you see here is an example of the work that our catalog specialist is doing. And what we're doing is photographing each of these blocks, recording all the metadata for the circus that was in it, what's the subject matter, what color was this used to print, and you start to get an idea of the scope and size of the collections that are here. Most, if not all, of these large blocks came from a print shop in Cincinnati called the Inquirer Printing Company. Inquirer Printing got founded in 1895 in Cincinnati, and they are still in operation. Fourth generation brothers, Mike and John Anderson, are running this fantastic print shop in Cincinnati, and in 2015, they contacted us and said, "Would you like to purchase our collection of vintage printing blocks?" And we said, yes, we would, just based on going down and assessing the complexity and the beauty of this printed matter. And we packed it into 7 semi-trucks and drove it up to Two Rivers, and it nearly filled the storage space that you see here. One of the beautiful things we have is not only wood blocks, but also magnesium engravings. And what do we got here, Jim?
Well, the Dynamite Girl, Helen Howe, was sort of a feature of your county fair or circus, and, well, they blew her up. So that they would put her in a box, she would explode out of it. Now, these are things that you really don't know about when you get a collection like this. So when you open a crate, we don't know if it'll be circus. We don't know if it might be fair. It might be a 12-foot long polar bear that's part of a billboard. So it's often difficult to know where the part goes. And while for some people looking at that, they might say, I really don't know what you're even looking at, whereas I know it's the backside of a polar bear. So you learn some really odd stuff in working with this collection. And of course, we're also researching it to some extent, because if you want to print it, it would be great to know copyright. So we have we have got a good start on cataloging all of this, and we have also begun printing it. We may have time to look in on that a little bit later, but I think at this point we'll leave the...
Can we just talk about the cannon since we're talking about explosions?
You can.
This
Absolutely.
is a beautiful two-color poster you're looking at here by the Cole Brothers Circus, and the headline is "The Great
Will Know."
The Great Will Know. He's actually shot from a giant cannon, and I don't know how long your career can last as being cannon fodder, but you know, I guess well, I'm sure he had a blast doing it. Anyway, let's go on to...
Oh,
sorry. I had to use that one. Why wouldn't I use that one?
I guess it's time to leave this room.
Well, it's...
All right. So, side note about Will Know, he began as a trapeze artist and fell. And so, injuring himself pretty badly, it was during his rehab that he decided it would be better to take on a safer job in the fair, and so he decided to be shot from a cannon. I'm not sure that that was safer, but it is interesting to consider his choices for careers. Back in the central room here, we're going to be passing a lot of posters on the wall, which is not just Hamilton work, but work by a lot of our friends who have either come to the museum or just sent us those things that they're working on. And it's kind of an informal gallery. This room is more the formal gallery. And so what we're looking at today happens to be an annual exhibit that we refer to as New Impressions. And so some of you may know that Stephanie Carpenter kind of engineered this project. And I believe that we are in the 6th year of that project, but these are artists from around the world who have contributed, and it's been a really nice growth, I guess you could say, because it connects us with printers in a really wonderful way, and also it brings us into audiences that we normally don't approach. So we'll head out of the gallery and begin moving on toward the teaching end of the building, I guess. We're kind of quickly heading through an exhibit of work done by the volunteers at Hamilton, a really important part of the museum from what they give us, but the fact that they all do artwork in their own right is pretty great. But we're now in the classroom area of the museum, and it's a really wonderful space where we can typically accommodate up to 12 individuals and teach them how to do letterpress printing. So what we've got are show card presses scattered around the room, and it gives people a lot of space where they can use this entire wall of type to choose from when they take classes at the museum. However, the letterpress classes are only one aspect of the teaching that we do. Stephanie does bookmaking workshops. We bring in visiting teachers as well to do a number of things, but it becomes a really great space that gives people a lot of freedom and flexibility to work on a variety of projects.
One of the opportunities that we have when we teach letterpress printing workshops is the students are able to not only use wood type that we have in the collection, and we've got big wood type and we've got small wood type. You can see a beautiful 25 line L here, and then this nice big beautiful number 1. So students can draw from a variety of wood type sizes and styles, but they can also use image blocks. This image block is important to us because it came from the Globe collection. The Globe collection came out of Chicago, and the museum acquired it in 2005. And part of that collection was the most beautiful Jolly Roger print that was about 14 inches square. Because that block was something like 90 years old, cracks started to form in it. And one of the things that we recognize in terms of preservation and using this equipment is, rather than just retiring that block, we took proofs from that block, used CNC routing to cut what we call a surrogate. And so we cut surrogates in a variety of sizes here, and these beautiful objects get to live on through our workshop process and get to be used over and over again for the first time, if that makes sense. So we're going to keep walking You get a little bit of an idea of the number of presses. We got one of our amazing volunteers working over there, Larry. Smile and wave, Larry. See, that's Larry smiling and waving. Along this wall here, you start to see some of the other prints that have been made both by workshop attendees and our friends who donate posters to us, or posters that they do on our behalf. And then sometimes it's archival posters. So it's a nice array of inspiration for people who take workshops who may be a beginner. They may have 20 years of printing experience. But for us as a museum, it's really important to make these workshops accessible for a variety of skill levels. One of the things that we like with letterpress printing, especially on the show card presses like you see in the classroom space, there's a really low threshold for learning how to do this kind of printing. It's really straightforward. You put the image on the press bed, you ink it up, you lay your piece of paper on top, and you roll your roller across. And what you're seeing on the wall here, again, are more examples of things that were done by workshop participants, some typeface specimens from friends, and for us, it's really a lot about our mission in terms of being a working museum. We are not just an organization that puts a sheet of plexiglass between you and the artifact. You are able to use the artifacts as part of our education initiative.
So, since you're talking about that, I think what we'll do now is head toward our press room, which will be the last portion of the tour this morning. But it gives you an idea of, how we make it work. And it is the great thing about the museum that it's a working museum. And it's wonderful for me because my job is to print pretty much everything that we have. So the press room is pretty large. It's got a variety of presses that we have acquired from different places. It allows for staff to work in here pretty well. That is typically, I'd say mostly Steph and Bill and I, but it's great because whether we're working on a Corex or an Aspern, a couple of German presses, we've got a variety of Vandercooks, as well as a Heidelberg, some Chandler and Price platen presses in the corner, but then we've got some really big things that I can use to take advantage of those massive blocks that we've got. And so at present, what I'm working on is referred to as a one-sheet poster, and that is 26 by 40 inches. It is something from the collection where I get to assess its quality and if it's printable. Some of these things over time get damaged or they can warp, but this is a great press for kind of determining if this is something that could go on to a slightly larger production. So this is really designed as a sign press. It's got a bed of 40 by 60 inches. So at the moment I'm about to work on the second of a two-color piece. Halloween Night is a promotional piece out of the Globe collection. So the orange plate is, well, it's in Bill's hands right now. So you can see that example of the carved block as well as the printed piece. And so the second portion of that is the black plate, which I have on the press right now. And I can give you just a little idea of how we need to handle these things, because over time they get warped, they get dry. We have to be quite careful in terms of how we deal with them. Sometimes the direction that we print them in is all really critical in terms of preserving the blocks. There are times where we can begin working on a four-color poster only to learn that they're so distressed that you can't even finish the piece. So it's this is a good place to print very slowly, and then to make sure that whatever cracks may have begun in it don't get any worse. So we've got a process of oiling the blocks to kind of keep them conditioned, if you will, and so it kind of helps in not pulling up more splinters as you go through the printing process. So we're lucky. We've got thousands and thousands of blocks that we get to print in this place, and it's such a great opportunity to work with those wonderful things that have been created in the last 100 years, basically. Oh, Bill's pulling out the last edition of the Halloween night piece. So I'm going to try and punch up that orange a little bit to make it a little more interesting. But you get to see where the cracks are, where the flaws are. But I can tell you that when I hit 80 years old, I'll have a few cracks and bumps as well. So not surprising, I guess. Thanks for joining us.